Good day. This is an audio fix re-release of The Lost Battalion. All thanks go to Ragekill, who fixed the audio so that you can finally hear Reginick now. And so, without further ado, here is the audio fixed version of The Lost Battalion. Good day, ladies and gentlemen. The Great War. The war to end all wars. World War I was a war that changed the face of the world forever. World War I ended the 19th century and brought forth the 20th century in blood and fire. Sadly, World War I was just a taste of things to come. In recent years, World War I has been out of the popular consciousness. It was seen as an inconclusive war. It was seen as, perhaps, shall we say, a boring war. There were no gallant feats of daring do on the scale of D-Day or the invasion of Iwo Jima. There was nothing that really caught the eye, so to speak. Now, as it's almost been 100 years since the end of it, World War I has been slowly returning to the popular consciousness. With the release of Battlefield 1 and a variety of other properties, more people now know a bit more about the Great War. Sadly, when it comes to the Great War, the level of knowledge is very limited. If you ask somebody what happened during World War I, you'll get practically nothing. One thing that's rather amusing is I actually asked an instructor back when I was in high school, well, what happened during World War I? I already knew the answer, but I wanted to see if they did. And well, the first thing I got was, well, you see Hitler, to which I couldn't help myself. I had to say, well, technically Hitler was only a Bohemian corporal at the time, and then they kind of looked at me and trailed off and walked away. That's the level of knowledge that even people who should know better have of World War I. Here's a bit of backstory on World War I. It began in 1914 and ended in 1918. It had the Allied powers, which were Britain and France and a variety of other countries, against the Central powers, which was primarily Austria-Hungary, Germany, and the Ottoman Empire, along with, I believe, Bulgaria. And they fought a war that the war aims were very it was hard to tell what each country wanted. It's also hard to say, was the war inevitable? But at the end of it, today we're not here to necessarily discuss the hows and whys of World War I, but instead discuss a film based upon an event that happened towards the end of World War I, The Lost Battalion, a film released in 2001. Now today I am joined with Reginick.
Hello.
You also know him as Wizard, otherwise known as Graphics Card Guy. Because in 2016, we met because he donated a graphics card, and I've spoken to him ever since, and he's a cool guy. So, do you want to start up with your view of Lost Battalion, or view of World War I? Like, what are your opinions on it?
Well, World War I is forgotten simply for the fact that it's the last Imperial War. The whole matter is actually a case of no one wanting to go to war, but no one being able to avoid it. During the 18th and 19th centuries, all of the nations involved were at an arms race, always building bigger, always building better, always recruiting more troops. Killing a Franz Ferdinand, if anything, is fortunately a bit of a ruse. While his death was important, and it did spark a lot of conflict, it was ultimately not the start of the war. The start of the war was the arms race. Everybody wanted to carve out their own miniature empire of the world.
Now, would you say that World War I was sort of the loss of, I wouldn't say innocence, but loss of the war is this great and glorious thing, and we've got to go out and get to fighting?
Oh, very much so. The war, basically, while from the U.S. side, we've lost incredible amounts of men and materials to it. It's called the Lost Generation War amongst the Europeans for a very good reason. They lost literally entire generations of young men this war. There are still places today in Europe where you can go and the earth still bears its scars from this war.
I think when it comes down to World War One, it was sort of the culmination of everything the 19th century had to offer. Because in the 19th century, it was still... Actually, it could even be said that it was the culmination of everything that kind of humanity was working towards at the time. Humanity, you know, throughout the millennia, has always been about these bigger and bigger conflicts and gaining more land and power and resources. And finally, it culminated in this big conflict. It was all of this optimism towards conflict. It was this sort of innocence as to the nature of warfare itself. I mean, there had been many massacres and tragedies of the past, but nothing on this scale.
Right. No one could ever foresee this scale. How do you predict millions upon millions of dead when the biggest conflict the world had ever seen had only involved a few thousand?
And I think also many people had the idea that it would be just like the previous big war on the continent, which was the Franco-Prussian War. For those who don't know what that is, because that's an even more obscure war than World War I sadly is, that was where Prussia, which would later become Germany, well, become one of the countries in Germany, but that's another topic in and of itself, went to war against France and was able to defeat them in, I think, 6 months. It was a very fast war, to say the least. And I think
back then generally were.
And yeah, they were generally limited wars. I mean, the last big war, I think, prior to World War One was the Civil War, or the U.S. Civil War, I should say.
Right, that was one of the bloodiest conflicts up until that point.
And it's rather interesting that nobody really drew that many lessons from it. I mean, they had trenches, and they kind of knew what they were what to do to avoid artillery. But I think technology had advanced so far that there was no way to really defend the average infantryman from being minced just trying to get across no man's land.
Right. The Industrial Revolution brought about many great things, but it also brought about much, much horror.
Which, you know, this is actually getting into more philosophy than it is the war itself. And we'll get to the movie in a moment, but you can't talk about the movie without talking about the war. Is that the Industrial Revolution changed a great many things, but I think it also changed warfare in the way that the same way products were able to be distributed to the millions. Now with war could be had in the millions. You could have millions of troops now. You could have, you know, billions of shells and things of that nature, whereas at one point you couldn't. And it could, and I would go as far to say that all the advancements in technology led to this war just being physically possible, whereas in the past, or even just 10 or 20 years prior, it couldn't have actually lasted as long as it did.
Very much so. I mean, we saw advancements, not just weaponry and not just to the material the men on multiple fronts had, but even to the ration. Best case example is all conflicts before this, canning was not a big thing. The best thing you could do to preserve was either pickle or jar something. Nowadays, you could, you know, the times of World War I, you could can ration, meaning you had a very mobile fort.
That's something few people really think about is food and water for the troops, which actually becomes a big issue for the Lost Battalion itself. So, let's get into the movie. Lost Battalion was released in 2001 and chronicles the adventures of the Lost Battalion, a battalion of American troops at the very end of the war. In fact, as of this recording, which is being recorded on October the 8th, 2018, the actual conflict that the Lost Battalion was a part of ended literally yesterday, on October the 7th. So if you thought you had a bad weekend, just remember, you weren't being shelled. A lot. I first saw the movie back in 2001, back when I was 12 years old. I used to watch PBS all the time. PBS is, of course, the public broadcasting system, otherwise known as Channel 8 in Houston. It's where educational programs would be shown and things of that nature. What's kind of funny, though, is it has nothing to do with the film, but it has to do with PBS. I don't know if they still exist today. They might. But later in its lifespan, like when I was like a late teen, I had stopped watching them when I finally got access to cable. But it's actually kind of funny. They started showing rap videos like late at night. It's kind of weird, you know?
Interesting. Our public access went from showing documentaries and such, very much like yours, into showing reruns of Bob Ross and Britcom.
Well, at least it's not rap videos. Street Flavor is what it was called. That was definitely...
cringy.
Yeah, yeah. So, I saw that back in 2001. I'd already known about World War One. I was definitely a nerd then, and a nerd now. In fact, when I was an adolescent, I actually used to get in trouble for sneaking off to the library. I'm not even joking. And just reading their entire historical section. So I already knew a good amount about World War One. What's funny, though, is in the intervening time, a lot of those history books have been changed in some ways. Not necessarily for the worse, not like revisionist history, but at the time, a lot of the history that was available was sources from like the 1970s and things of that nature. The old adage of lions led by donkeys, where like the generals were really bad and didn't care about the men, whereas these days it's seen as like many of the major generals like Sir Douglas Haig and things of that nature, they weren't as bad as history has portrayed them.
Yes, the big thing is the war really advanced far more than its communication needs. And communication was still mostly done very little over telephone, very little over radio, and a lot over telegraphic carrier.
Which is kind of weird when you think about it. Actually, loading up a pigeon with a letter and sending it somewhere. I still don't really know how that even is supposed to work.
It requires quite a bit of training on the owner's part. It is a work-intensive process, but pigeons actually have a very good homing instinct as birds go. Once they find a spot, they can generally find it, even if they are turned around.
And that is just crazy. So, the Lost Battalion begins with the battalion itself, whose name I can't remember at the moment.
77.
The 77th Battalion?
Yes, 77, which is actually a scratch unit of several units, but for this, it is officially known as the 77th or Liberty Division.
All right. It shows the film starts up sort of introducing each individual character. One of the most poignant scenes from the very beginning is, of course, the commander, and the commander is played by a very talented actor. And this film, despite being a TV movie, really knows how to use its time well. And in the first 5 to 10 minutes, it shows you everything you need to know about World War One. It shows the commander trying to encourage some men to get back across to no man's land to the friendly trench, and they all get shot down before they even get close. And one of the last things that happens to the last man, who is actually blinded by, I believe, gas, he gets shot, and there's some blood that just squirts all over his face. That is harsh, but it really goes to show you just what that conflict was like.
Yeah, basically, the soldier had definitely been affected by mustard gas. Nasty stuff. It causes skin lesions, blinding. It's really quite terrible, and thankfully, such is no longer used.
Yes. There's actually some more scenes. Well, there's more scenes where you see people affected by gas. After you're introduced to the commander, you're introduced to the individual men. The battalion is filled with men from a variety of different locations. You got some people from New York. You got the lieutenant from Texas, which I liked. You actually see them all on this military truck, and as they're sitting there bullshitting back and forth, there's actually a line of blinded men go by. I mean, everything about this film is efficient. They show you a lot in one or two scenes. So eventually, the men that's going to make up this battalion and make up the characters of the movie end up at the trenches with the commander. The commander is then briefed by the general, who's like, acceptable losses, blah, blah, blah. They got to go and hold a position in the Argonne forest. And so the scenes here really just kind of set up the characters. You have the captain, who's a professional soldier. The captain is, of course, underneath the commander, who's a major. Major Hennessy is the name of the commander. And the captain, of course, has to talk to the lieutenant because the lieutenant's from Texas. And the other men who are from New York and other places like that don't really respect him because of his accent. It's actually kind of funny. Really, a lot of the accents have disappeared over the years due to television and movies and things of that nature. But back then, a person from, say, Texas would sound very, very different from someone in New York.
Very much so. Although these days there are still a few places where the accent is very, very thick, such as Boston. Love you guys, but you know exactly what you're up to when you say you want to pack the cat.
Or chowder. Chowder. So yeah, you got the initial scenes, and the actors portray their characters very well. What's kind of crazy is how well cast this entire movie actually is. The captain and... Wait, go on?
Very much so. And they got the wardrobe and the casting almost exactly right. Almost everyone in this cast looks like they're pre-World War One service. Disturbingly very well cast.
It's almost like they're like clones almost. The guy playing Major Hennessy is a little more, I guess, handsome than the original, but very close. Very, very close. Because I think the original, the original Major Hennessy, the real one, kind of had a slightly lumpier face. Ever so slight. But the wardrobe is actually quite good. I didn't even think about that. What's funny about the wardrobe, though, is the more you know about World War One, the more you can really appreciate it. So, like, if you binge watch, like, the Great War YouTube series, like, you'll know what the puttees are supposed to look like. And the more you know about the weapons, the more you realize just how much they got right with that. When I watched it back in 2001, all I knew was Springfield rifle. That was it. I didn't know any difference between that and the 1917 Enfield, but now, as an adult, I can tell the difference between each individual rifle.
Right, and it actually does come into play in this movie for the simple fact that everyone is kitted out properly. Even down to the show machine gun.
Yes, that actually reminds me of a particularly hilarious scene at the beginning that's setting up everything. It's like, yeah, this thing's a piece of junk. And it really is. What's funny about the show is the fact that, you know, you would think that that's a lot of historical exaggeration, but when you actually see these things in real life, getting one to work is a very difficult prospect.
Right. It required the machine gunner to really stay on top of cleanliness and maintenance, because there's just so many points for dirt, debris, and awfulness to ingress into that firearm.
And the magazines having those great big holes in them. Yeah, I'm not really sure why they thought that was a good idea, but, you know, World War One, this was still new days for automatic firearms in general, so...
Right. It's one of those we actually had to take every lesson learned from that war and say, that was not so much a smart idea. Let's do something else.
Exactly. And so we're introduced to all the major characters. Now, all the major characters aren't particularly original. It's pretty much what you'd expect from just about any war movie. They are portrayed quite well, and they're generally likable. But spoiler alert, they're all dead. Just so you know, they're all dead in 2018. Because if they weren't, they'd either be vampires or immortals.
In which case, this would be more like Highlander and less like a war movie.
Although that would be kind of awesome, though. Got the Kurgan as the German commander.
Definitely make for an interesting idea.
So, well, after we're introduced to all the characters, it's time to go over the top. And they do just that. The over-the-top scene is fairly accurate to what happened. There's a lot of shell fire. You see a lot of death going on. It's not as gory as, say, something like Saving Private Ryan or any of the modern-day war films, but it still gets the point across, and you see people just drop like flies as they go. And they eventually do reach the German trenches, but damn.
Yeah, this movie pulls no punches. It actively tries to show the utmost respect to those who fought. When they say war is hell, look to movies like this, and you'll quickly understand what that means.
So after they capture the German trenches, they keep fighting through the forest. What's interesting about when they go through the forest is, and they pretty much are going to stay in the forest the entire movie, because in real life they fought to the forest. Actually, we'll get to that in a moment. When they get to the forest, they really do portray how scary it would be walking through a forest, hearing a gunshot, and not having a clue where it's coming from. Now, most of the movie, actually all the rest of the movie, is going to take place in just one location. It'll, of course, skip around to the base, the Allied base, and then skip around to the German base and the German trenches, but this is pretty much where you're going to see the whole movie. And the whole movie is just one long meat grinder. It's just them trying to survive. What ended up happening is they're stuck in this forest. There's supposed to be a French battalion and another American battalion go in with them. They got held up, and now they're stuck in the middle of the German line. They don't know where they are. Nobody knows where they are because you got to remember World War One. They don't have the technology that we do today. There's the idea of GPS, is the fever dream of a madman. They don't have the technology to even think about such a thing. The best they've got is a plane, and that comes into play later. Now, talking about bad communications, they did lay down phone wire, and that got cut almost immediately.
Right, and this is really what causes the bulwark of the problem. The French battalion, which was supposed to secure their left flank, unfortunately was beaten back by a separate German division. Elements of this certain division most likely are the culprits of those which cut the wire. This left 77th stranded. One of the worst case scenarios for them.
And all through the movie, they're running low on ammo, they're running low on food. There's actually a particularly harrowing scene where they're trying to get some water. And of course, there's a sniper set up to shoot anybody who tries to get some water. And of course, somebody does get shot, but they do eventually get him, and they finally get some water. There's dead bodies all over the place because they can't bury them because they're busy trying not to get shot. The Germans are not portrayed as villains, although the movie does fall into the same old trope of demonic German, where every time the Germans talk, they just sound evil.
Well, remember this. It comes down to language. The French pronounce tank tank. We pronounce it tank. The Germans at the time pronounced it Panzerkampfwagen.
So there you go. I actually asked a German speaker just to say My Little Pony in German. Even that sounded evil. I'm not even joking. So, yeah, they sound evil.
Trying to learn German, I can actually understand how you could come to that, because it is a very guttural, very primal language. And the funny thing is, it's the basis for English.
Which you wouldn't think, but yeah, it is. It's just all those years of linguistic drift that got us to where we are today. There's actually something funny I read once, that English is the language that takes other languages out behind the alley and mugs them for words.
Very much applicable here. The German portrayal actually is fairly honest and true to what it is. Remember, this was World War One. There were no Nazis. So, the Germans actually got screwed in this war just about as bad as every other nation, if not worse, by the end of it. Like I say, when they say war is hell, here's why.
Exactly. One other detail that was kind of cool, I don't know if you noticed it, because I didn't notice the first time I saw it, but I was paying attention now that I knew what to look for. The Germans didn't have access to rubber, which you need for tires. And the trucks on the German side, if you look, the tires are actually made out of metal. I made sure to pay special attention to that. They actually were made out of metal.
Which was okay, not optimal for the rough land, which was blown up around them, but absolute hell on paved roads. It was a total logistical nightmare for them.
Yeah, I mean, metal tires, I'd imagine that was a problem with some spines, too.
So suspension did not exist back then, so you had to have both kidneys, spine, and a rear of steel to be able to understand the sheer horror of riding in one of those vehicles.
So, as the movie progresses, things get worse and worse. There's a few little bits of drama that are thrown in that's kind of funny. Like, they just won't give up. They won't stop. We might need to bring in the stormtrooping, which did exist. And what's kind of funny is back in the day when I first heard that stormtroopers were real, when I say back in the day, I'm talking like less than sub 10 years old. So the only stormtroopers I knew were the ones from Star Wars. And so when someone had mentioned to me, like, yeah, stormtroopers, oh yeah, they were real. I was like, what? They were real? How is that possible? It's like, oh, it's not the Star Wars stormtroopers. But they start talking about bringing in the stormtroopers. Now, they don't do that till the very end of the movie, but we'll get to that in a moment. So they're still stuck out there, and the war scenes are, once again, really, really well done. Everybody looks filthy, which is one thing that a lot of war movies kind of get wrong, where everyone is way too clean.
Oh, yes, war is anything but clean. Especially in World War One.
And
the filth, the mud, the blood, the absolute horror of all of it. And imagine the poor medical staff having to clean wounds and all this.
And that's another point in the movie is where a lot of the men are just wounded and they literally don't have anything they can do for them. They can't send them back to the aid station because the aid station's all the way back at headquarters. The concept of the MASH unit wouldn't be invented until the very end of World War II. So if you got wounded, you're pretty much screwed.
Very much so. A certain piece of shrapnel ends up in one individual and stays throughout it.
Yes, that, of course, is the captain. He gets a piece of wood stuck in him. He, of course, survived the war and I think died at, like, age 70-something, I think.
Yeah, he lived all throughout the war, and his service record is something you need to look into. It is rather impeccable. Man is... For a soldier who did not want to fight, he is a man's man.
And the captain, whose name I can't remember at the moment...
Hold
on. But he does mention through the course of the film that he fought with the Rough Riders during the Spanish-American War, thus making him pretty old by that point, but he was definitely able to hold his own. There's a few tactical... Oh my god?
Captain Holden.
Captain Holden. That name should have stuck with me, but it didn't, unfortunately.
Holderman has an exemplary service record, so much so that he's one of the Medal of Honor recipients, as well as the Silver Star.
Which is not an easy thing to do, that's for sure. Did Major Hennessy get the Medal of Honor? I think so.
Yes, Major Hennessy, and it is a Congressional Medal of Honor holder.
That's what I thought. There's a few tactical things that seem a little strange. I'm not sure if those were World War I tactics or not. The Germans, when they do a counterattack, they form a rifle line, which seemed a bit weird to me. That was more of a Napoleonic tactic. I wouldn't think they would do that with, modern-day bolt-action rifles, but that very well could have actually happened.
It did to some degree. Remember, the Prussian forces, or the Central Forces, were... the reason I use the word Prussian is because they very much were. They were very disciplined, very hardcore drilled. And these are men who, while pressed into service in probably one of the worst ways, you can't knock them for their discipline. Their tactics, their means, and the war as a whole is questionable, but you cannot knock the discipline of men on either side of this fight.
And that gets into something that's kind of interesting. Towards the, let's say, 3/4 mark of the film, there's, of course, the Texas lieutenant gets captured by the Germans, and he, of course, is brought back to the German HQ, and they're like trying to question him, but they don't actually torture him. That's more of a World War II thing than a World War I thing. And eventually...
Right.
Wait, go on.
Right. And in World War One, while the whole war was regrettable, most of the people realized this was, by the time your commanders had seen the trenches, had seen the result, they'd realized they were in over their head, and this was not. It's you're throwing away entire generation of people. So torture was used far, far less.
And
It was used, but much.
yeah, and it was less of a the way that the India, that's actually his name, I think, isn't it? India Idel, something like that. Let's just say the Idel World War II series. He actually calls World War II a war against humanity, whereas World War One really wasn't to a degree. There was still some civilian massacres, primarily in the Balkans, but just nothing on the scale of World War II.
Right. It was a case of we didn't have any armistice agreements, but let's be perfectly honest with ourselves here. While the war was brutal, absolutely, unflinchingly, unshockingly, and without merit, brutal, the morals and standards back then were far different. Most men in enlisted service, even if draftee, were generally trying to be as professional as possible and were, for lack of the term, any other term to put it, as gentlemanly as possible.
Which almost seems kind of naive by today's standards, sadly. Because what's kind of funny is the one of the German commanders even offers the Texas lieutenant some tea, which he doesn't accept, but that's not something you'd really see from a World War II sort of thing. Ultimately, the Texas lieutenant is sent back to the battalion with a paper saying, just surrender, think of your wounded. And then Major Hennessy, and he did this in real life, he picks up this white flag, because the Texas lieutenant was sent with a white flag, so he wouldn't be shot. Picks up the white flag and throws it, and says, go to hell. That actually happened.
Yep. Hennessy. Charles White Whittlesey had essentially huevos the size of church bells. The man, while coming from unassuming stock, he was a New York lawyer. You'd swear he was born in Texas as a cowboy. The guy just does not give up.
And that's a fact. And that's one of the things. He looks very bookish. Like, if you were to look at him, it's like, oh, it's some guy, some wimpy guy, he's got glasses on, he can't do anything. But nope, you put him in a situation like that, and he really rose to the occasion. And all through the movie, you see this. And the guy portraying him has a really commanding voice. It's a very deep voice. It's a very strong voice. And throughout the movie, like the captain and a variety of other characters are like, these men would follow you into hell, and you can see why they would, because he was one of those commanders that actually cared about the men. He didn't just see them as something to be thrown away. And you can see this literally from like the very first scene.
Very much so. There's one particular scene. Well, this is most likely Hollywood at work here as opposed to the real deal. It's so well directed, so well written, that you could see this being something out of reality. He approaches one of his wounded who is clutching at himself, profuse blood, and the wounded man, very now clearly dying from the shrapnel wounds, is asking Whittlesey to read from his Bible, which, you understand, there's no field chaplain at the time, so Whittlesey filling in for the role of field chaplain was a very, very noble thing for him to do. He takes this small Bible, and there's so much blood that not a single page of it can be read.
And in that... Wait, go on?
Go ahead.
I was going to say, in that scene, that guy, he was actually blown in half, and you actually see it.
Yeah. He manages to remember a particular verse in the Bible, and you'll have to forgive me because I'm a bit rusty and I do not remember which verse it is. But he eloquently recites it perfectly back to the soldier as a means of giving him his last right. That is a level of respect that you do not see in a lot of war movies.
And I think it's because this wasn't meant to be, a Hollywood production. This was some sort of made-for-TV thing. And, like you compare... This movie, I think, is a lot harder core than Fury from 2014.
There's no compare.
I mean, Fury... I won't say it was a terrible movie. Now, for those who don't know, Fury is a war film from 2014 about this... I assume it was a fictional tank. I could be wrong.
I would have to investigate it. I saw it as a popcorn flick, and it was fine for what it was, but compared to the older films about World War II, no, it's just a popcorn flick.
I would basically compare it to sort of like 300 in how it approached the source material. It was meant to be more awesome, more. They took everything up to 11, is what they did.
It almost needs to be a giant neon sign before you walk in the theater, just blinking. This is a dramatization. This is a dramatization.
Dramatization may not have happened. Or you could just say it's World of Tanks, the movie.
Pretty much.
But in this movie, it's really... there's even a scene during one of the shelling scenes. Oh, I almost forgot the scene. So they finally do get a message back to headquarters. And headquarters starts shelling the Germans, or so they think. But then the shells start dropping on them. This also happened in real life. And they end up sending a message back with a carrier pigeon, and it makes it back just in time to stop two minimen from getting blown up. You actually see a guy just get completely vaporized. Like, it just vaporized. I mean, this stuff happens in real life. Just turned into this giant pool of blood.
And in this case, they pull no punches here. In fact, this is one of the very few times where slow-mo is important to make a point. And they make this point with all of the subtlety of a jackhammer to the groin. This man was killed in one of the most violent, explosive, and utterly thorough ways possible, right in front of Whitlam.
Which is definitely not fun, to say the least. And we'll get back to him later, because he actually has a tragic ending, unfortunately. Not during the battle, though, but we'll save that for a little bit later. Okay, so they're getting shelled, they're getting blown up, everybody's dying. And actually, back to the shelling part, you actually do see a scene where one of the commanders runs out. It's like, stop shooting! And literally, the last part of that scene is literally him crying, which, once again, that's a very effective, emotional scene, because he knows what just happened.
Right, and it actually touches upon the psyche. This is something important, because to everyone who's in the modern Call of Duty and all this, danger close is not a rally cry, and friendly fire isn't. This man had, in sheer moment, through well-directed, well-acted scenery here, this man is shown to the audience that he has to deal with this emotional guilt for the rest of his life. There are consequences. He was told that the coordinates were checked twice. So, of course, he's going to tell his men to just unleash hell upon the coordinate. Problem is, 276.4, the map grid, was with his men. And now he's realizing this is hitting him. Well, I would say like a Mack truck, but they didn't exist back then, so we'll have to go with a train.
So yeah, war is not a game, that is for sure. So, as the movie progresses, the HQ eventually sends out a plane. Now, here's the thing about this. Remember, no GPS. Aerial photography is still very new. It's like 3 years old by this point. Now, the plane's flying around, and eventually the plane does see, and it's a British plane, by the way, so this movie's not one of those where it's just America. They actually do show somebody from another country, which is very good, because American films are very bad about that. Need we talk about U-571, which is so bad. I mean, it's just...
That's jingoistic to an absurd degree.
For those who don't know, U-571 is this really horrible film. Well, it could be a well-made film. I have not seen it, but the idea of it is terrible. Okay, you got, this American team that takes over this German sub, U-571, to get the Enigma code machines so the German code can be broken. Now, that sounds cool, right? But that's complete fiction. The German codes were broken by the British and the Poles. So, yeah, that doesn't make for a very good... Well, there is a movie following Turing that came out a few years back, but still, it's one of those things of, America! Fuck yeah! It just was kind of disrespectful to the memories of all the people that actually did work on it, but whatever.
Team America Unterseebooten Police, not exactly a good movie at all.
So,
I mean, especially saying that the Enigma machine, cracking that code is actually what, allows the state of technology starting from there to now is the very reason our voice is getting to you. Computing got its start there.
But America, fuck yeah. So, bro forces... No, wait, go on.
Go for it.
Bro force aside, they the pilot does see the Lost Battalion, but then the Germans start shooting at him. Because remember, we're talking basically one step up from a box kite, so they're not really flying at like 30,000 feet. They're flying at like a couple thousand, maybe just a couple hundred. And so you can... Am I going?
In this case, it's just a couple hundred. To maintain visibility of a human silhouette, especially through a thick forest, which this one definitely is, to go take a look at Argonne, and remember, that's what it looks like after it was bombed.
So
he had to be going at least 200. I mean, he's just barely above the tree line.
And this is actually a scene I remember. I remembered from 2001 to present day. He's flying around. He finally finds him. Now, I think he takes a couple pictures where he writes it down on the map. I can't remember exactly.
He writes it down on this He writes the coordinates down on the map.
Okay. And so the Germans start shooting at him. Now, remember, this is a fabric-covered biplane. There's no armor. I don't think they could even have put any armor with the weak engines.
There's zero way they could put any armor on there. And given the plane he was using, there was zero way they could put a camera on there. I mean, he'd be lucky if he took off if he ate a big breakfast.
So he's got nothing. They start shooting up the plane, and they hit him. And this is something that really stuck with me. Despite getting literally shot to shit, he still makes it back to base. And the guys see him land. The plane barely is able to land. And like it's on, I don't think it's on fire, but it's still smoking. And they find the book. It's covered in blood. Because remember, this is a real war movie here. And that's how they find him. And there's one final battle after that.
Right. The plane comes over at day 4. Now understand, Ulysses' men are in a horrible, horrible pickle. This is from the 2nd to the 8th. By day 3, they were already what tactically would be considered SOL. By the time that plane comes by, they are bordering on combat ineffective.
And they've got no food, no water, very little ammo. And the final battle, I'm not sure if this happened in real life, but it makes for a good conclusion to the film. The stormtroops finally show up. And they show up...
It did happen.
Oh, it did happen? Okay. It seemed too unbelievable to be real, but they show up with flamethrowers, literally setting people on fire. And this is a pretty good conclusion. That's evidently happened in real life. And they got to fight back these stormtroops. Now remember, very little food, hardly any water. Everybody's been shot, blown up, stabbed again, blown up again, and shot again. And they still are able to hold the line against the stormtroops with the flamethrowers. That's one thing that a lot of people forget is I think the flamethrowers in real life would probably be worse than the ones in the movie, but...
Yes. while it wasn't true napalm, I mean, that came later. This is just under 200 men facing off against a German line of right at around 480 to just under 500 at this point, when you count in the stormtrooper reinforcement. The Prussian Guard is who they're facing. The Prussian Guard were sent in not just to, we'll just use flamethrowers to be as vicious as possible. So this is, a case of a little bit of directorial shorthand. The Flammenwerfer troopers were sent in to burn the forest completely down. They didn't care for it. It's like, okay, this might be an early warning system for us. This might be an early warning line. But these Americans are a thorn on our side, and they cannot be tolerated to hold this position. So if you can't keep a position, can't hold a position, you deny your enemy the position.
And so there's a really cool scene. Once again, I'm not sure if this really happened. There's no way for us to really know if it did, where Hennessy literally stabs to death this flamethrower trooper, and it's once again shows that he's a badass. It could have happened. There's no way to really know, but they eventually fight them off, and then finally the film ends with some reinforcements finally reaching them. Or actually, wait, did the reinforcements reach them, or did the Germans retreat?
It's actually a bit of both. The Germans had a tactical fallback within this time, thankfully, and by grace of God, this is a miracle. They were able to get a line up to the 77th Battalion, reinforcing them and taking them off the field, basically replacing. Now, at this moment, there's 254 men total. 197 of these men are killed, not of the total they had, about 554 to 575. 197 men killed outright. 150 are missing, captured, wounded, or combat ineffective, not counting for their runner. As battles go, there is bravery, and there is bravery teetering upon insanity. Major Whitley's men almost border on insanity, but they actually had a few small advantages. Those being that insane bravery and commitment to the fight, and the other being the Germans weren't, up until day 6, were not fully aware of the numbers. By day 3, they thought they were outnumbered, so they were fighting on the back foot.
And that's one of the things to keep in mind when it comes to warfare, is that, once again, you don't see this in any sort of movies or video games, but in real life, there's so much unknown. The very concept of the fog of war is that if you think there's more troops than there really are, then you'll believe there's more troops than there really are, and that will affect how you fight. The insane bravery shown by the 77th is something that, well, the higher morale you have with your troops, the more they can actually do. The human mind will give up long after the body has wanted to give up. And so it's one of those things. The higher morale you have, the more chance of a success you have. Now, that's not the case all the time. Like, if you have really high morale in 5 guys and you send them against a machine gun nest, they're probably all going to die, but you get the idea.
Cover is important. Use it well.
And ultimately, the film ends with Major Hennessy talking to the general. General Anderson, I believe his name was. And I think he went on to have a fairly decent career. And Hennessy's final speech was actually pretty good. Now, I'm not sure it wouldn't fly today, because of the standards of military discipline are very different today than what they were back in World War I. But he's like, these men are better than you. They're better than me. And he's just constantly extolling how great his men are. And then the film pretty much ends with them walking away. And the sad part about Major Hennessy is he, of course, would survive the war, because the war would end pretty soon there. Actually, it ends on November 11th.
Right,
So,
less than 5 full weeks after.
so
His push was actually very important. It's one of the things that actually helped break the German line. So while it is very easy to dismiss the actions of the upper echelons and the military pushing into this, understand it was his bravery that allowed that line, which was before this moment seen as near unbreakable, to be pushed back and eventually broken. All this for one hill, folks. All this for one hill.
and that's something really to remember when it comes to warfare. There's a lot of death, a lot of dying, and it really just doesn't come across, especially these days, with how, safe and secure everyone is. People complain about the stupidest of things. You can't even clap in some places, but 100 years ago, people were fighting and dying for that one location, and ultimately, it worked. And I think that's one of the aspects of the film that was really well done. It doesn't come down on the side of either the commander or the general. Both can be seen as right. It's like the commander of the 77th didn't want his men to die, but the general ultimately was proven right. Their sacrifice was not in vain, as it did, in one small part, help end the war.
And the general, he in the movie, he is seen almost as a bit of an older, doddering fool in the fact that he's very by the book. And it is true he did issue a no retreat order that anybody seen to be retreating or advocating for a retreat under general military order, general army order, was to be shot. That's a bit extreme, but understand, while the communication was FUBAR, communication is essentially what led to the Lost Battalion, what led to this whole incident. The lack of it and the breakdown of the communication cycle. The general realizes in this final scene of the movie that yes, this was indeed hell, and he has to live with that. He has to live with the deaths of his men on his conscience for the rest of his life. So in the end, while he's almost vilified, they pull it back and they make him human.
And that's one of the best aspects of this film, is that it's just not one narrative they're trying to push. They're trying to be as fair as they possibly can. And that's one of the things you gotta love about made-for-TV movies sometimes. They're not trying to please everyone. They're not trying to infuse everything with this happy ending kind of crap, And, unfortunately, the Major did not have a particularly happy ending. While he did indeed survive the war and lasted until, I think, 1920s, all of the death that he experienced really weighed on his conscience, and there's a letter that he wrote saying that he just couldn't really take it anymore. This is shortly before he died, that men from his old battalion would constantly tell him of their problems, and he constantly felt guilty about what had happened. And ultimately, as far as we know, he ended up committing suicide by jumping into some water. Well, I say he jumped into some water. He was on a ship. He left behind a will and some important letters for historical posterity, and then he just disappeared. So the idea is he jumped in the water, drowned, and died.
Right. He boarded the USS Taloa en route from New York to Havana. November 26, 1921 was when he did it. Now, this is after he was the pallbearer for the unknown soldier. So, if you ever in Arlington, or Washington, go to Arlington, give a salute from me.
So yeah, that is The Lost Battalion, a classic, and it's very easy to see. You can literally just find it on YouTube, as sadly it's pretty much fallen into obscurity, and I'm not I can understand why it has, because it didn't have a giant marketing budget and showed on, public access TV. But it is definitely a war movie worth watching if you really want to just get that one shot at really understanding World War One.
Very much so. The film is very well written, very well directed. I would say it's a sleeper movie. It's one of those that if you can pick it up on DVD, if you can watch it on YouTube, you can watch it any legal means possible, do so. It's worth it.
And so, I am Generallotz.
I'm Reginick.
And we're going to wish you good, Lost Battalion, whatever makes you happy.